Some moments in life change everything in a single heartbeat. They arrive without warning, carrying the weight of destiny on their shoulders. In a dimly lit bar in Virginia Beach, where military personnel gathered to forget the weight of their service, such a moment was about to unfold. What started as innocent military banter between strangers would reveal a legend walking among ordinary men. When a young Navy SEAL playfully asked a quiet bartender about his call sign, he had no idea he was about to meet someone whose very name had become whispered folklore in the darkest corners of special operations. The bartender's simple two-word response would freeze an entire room full of hardened warriors and change how they understood what it truly meant to serve. This is the story of how Battle Saint became more than just a call sign. It became a reminder that heroes don't always wear the uniforms we expect, and sometimes the most dangerous men are those who choose to serve drinks instead of death. The Anchor's Rest sat tucked between a pawn shop and a tattoo parlor 3 blocks from the main gate of Naval Station Norfolk. From the outside, it looked like any other dive bar that catered to military personnel. Neon beer signs flickered in salt-stained windows, and the parking lot was filled with pickup trucks bearing unit stickers and faded bumper magnets supporting the troops. But inside, the atmosphere carried something different, something that made even the most battle-hardened warriors speak in hushed tones and show uncommon respect. Marcus Rivera had been tending bar at the Anchor's Rest for 3 years, and in that time, he had become as much a fixture as the worn wooden stools and the collection of military patches that covered one entire wall. He was a man who commanded attention without ever asking for it. Tall and lean, with weathered hands that moved with precision behind the bar, salt and pepper hair that suggested he was somewhere north of 40, and eyes that held depths most people couldn't fathom. When he smiled, which was often, it never quite reached those eyes. They remained watchful, alert, as if constantly scanning for threats that others couldn't see. The regulars at the Anchor's Rest had grown accustomed to Marcus's quiet presence. He knew every customer's drink preference, remembered their stories, and listened to their problems with the patience of a confessor. He had a gift for knowing exactly when to engage in conversation and when to simply provide the comfort of silent understanding. Veterans from all branches found themselves drawn to his bar, though few could explain why. There was something about Marcus that made them feel understood, as if he had walked similar paths and carried similar burdens. On this particular Thursday evening in late October, the bar was filling up with its usual crowd. A group of Marines from Camp Lejeune had driven down for the weekend, their loud laughter mixing with the quieter conversations of Navy personnel who lived locally. The jukebox played classic rock at a volume that encouraged conversation without drowning it out, and the smell of grilled burgers from the kitchen competed with the familiar scent of beer and old wood that defined the place. Marcus moved behind the bar with his characteristic efficiency, pulling drafts and mixing drinks while keeping half an ear on the various conversations happening around him. He had learned long ago to read the room, to sense when tensions might be rising or when someone needed a friendly word. Tonight felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. There was an energy in the air, a subtle electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up occasionally. The front door opened with its familiar creak, and Marcus glanced up to see a young man in civilian clothes scanning the room with the careful eyes of someone trained to assess threats. The newcomer was probably in his late 20s, with the kind of lean, athletic build that spoke of serious physical conditioning. His haircut was regulation short, and despite wearing jeans and a polo shirt, something about his bearing screamed military. He moved with the controlled grace of a predator, each step calculated and purposeful. The young man made his way to the bar, nodding politely to other patrons as he passed. He chose a stool at the end, away from the main crowd, but with a clear view of both the entrance and the back exit. Marcus had seen this positioning behavior countless times before. It was the unconscious habit of someone who had learned never to sit with his back exposed. Marcus approached with a clean glass and a welcoming smile. The stranger looked up, revealing intelligent hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There were faint lines around those eyes that spoke of squinting against harsh sunlight and wind, and a small scar on his left temple that could have come from any number of activities. The stranger ordered a beer, something local and light, and Marcus pulled it from the tap with practiced ease. As he set it down, he noticed the man's hands, calloused in specific patterns that told their own story. These weren't the soft hands of a desk jockey, or even the generally roughened hands of someone who worked construction. These were hands that had gripped weapons, rappelled down ropes, and performed tasks that required both strength and delicate precision. For the next hour, the stranger sat quietly, nursing his beer and observing the room with the kind of attention that most people reserve for watching television. He wasn't antisocial. He nodded and exchanged pleasantries with nearby patrons, but he clearly preferred to listen rather than talk. Marcus found himself stealing glances at the man, trying to place him. There was something familiar about his presence, though he was certain they had never met. The crowd began to thin as the evening wore on. Some of the younger service members headed out to continue their night at clubs downtown, while others settled in for the long haul. The Marines from Camp Lejeune had claimed a corner table and were deep in animated conversation about their upcoming deployment. A group of Navy corpsmen occupied the bar center section. Their conversation focused on the eternal complaint about military healthcare bureaucracy. It was then that another figure entered the bar, and Marcus immediately recognized him as trouble. Staff Sergeant Tony Kowalski was a regular, though not one that Marcus particularly enjoyed serving. Kowalski was the kind of soldier who wore his service like a weapon, constantly reminding everyone around him of his rank and accomplishments. He was built like a fire hydrant, short, thick, and seemingly indestructible, with arms covered in tattoos that chronicled his various deployments. His face was permanently set in a scowl that suggested the world owed him something it hadn't delivered. Kowalski had a habit of challenging newcomers, especially those he suspected might be special operations. It was a dangerous game, but one he seemed to enjoy despite having been humbled more than once by men who didn't appreciate his interrogation techniques. Marcus had thrown him out twice in the past year for starting fights, but Kowalski always came back, usually with an apology and a promise to behave. Tonight, Kowalski's attention was immediately drawn to the quiet stranger at the end of the bar. Marcus could see the wheels turning in the staff sergeant's head as he took in a man's bearing, his positioning, and his obvious fitness. Kowalski ordered his usual whiskey and beer combo, then began making his way down the bar toward the stranger. Marcus busied himself with cleaning glasses, but kept both men in his peripheral vision. The stranger seemed aware of Kowalski's approach, but didn't show any obvious signs of concern. He continued sipping his beer and watching the room with the same casual alertness he had maintained all evening. Kowalski took the stool next to the stranger without being invited and immediately launched into his standard routine. He introduced himself with his full rank and unit designation, mentioned his recent return from deployment, and began probing for information about the stranger's background. The younger man answered politely, but vaguely, giving his first name as Jake and deflecting most of Kowalski's questions with good humor. This only seemed to fuel Kowalski's determination. He began name-dropping special operations units, describing missions in general terms, and watching Jake's reaction for any signs of recognition. Jake remained pleasant but non-committal, which Marcus could see was starting to frustrate the staff sergeant. Other patrons began to notice the interaction. Conversations quieted as people tuned in to what was becoming an increasingly tense exchange. Marcus moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but Jake seemed perfectly capable of handling himself without escalating the situation. Then, Kowalski made his mistake. Perhaps emboldened by Jake's apparent youth and calm demeanor, or maybe just frustrated by his inability to get a rise out of the stranger, he decided to get more direct. He turned fully toward Jake, invading his personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. The change in Jake was immediate and unmistakable. His casual posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders squaring and his weight redistributing in a way that suggested coiled potential energy. His eyes, which had been friendly and open, suddenly became flat and calculating. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that several nearby patrons actually took a step back. Kowalski, either too drunk or too stupid to recognize the warning signs, pressed on. He began questioning Jake's military service directly, suggesting that anyone who couldn't or wouldn't discuss their unit probably hadn't seen any real action. He implied that Jake was probably some kind of support personnel trying to pass himself off as something more impressive. The bar had gone completely quiet now. Even the Marines in the corner had stopped talking and were watching the developing confrontation. Marcus recognized the signs. This was either going to end with someone getting seriously hurt, or Jake was going to walk away and never come back. Neither option appealed to him. Jake finished his beer with deliberate slowness, set the empty glass down with precise control, and turned to face Kowalski directly. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that cut through the tense atmosphere like a blade. He told Kowalski that he appreciated the staff sergeant's service and understood the desire to connect with fellow veterans. He acknowledged that it was natural for people to want to share their experiences with those who might understand them. But he also made it clear that some conversations were private, some experiences weren't meant to be shared casually, and some people prefer to leave their work at work. The words themselves were reasonable, even diplomatic, but they were delivered with an undertone that suggested vast reserves of controlled violence. Jake wasn't threatening Kowalski directly, but something in his manner made it clear that continuing down the current path would be unwise. Kowalski, however, was too invested in his performance to back down gracefully. He laughed loudly and made a comment about young guys who watched too many movies and thought they were operators. He suggested that Jake's reluctance to discuss his service probably meant he had spent his enlistment pushing papers in some air-conditioned office. That's when Marcus decided to intervene. He had seen enough bar fights to know that this one would not end well for Kowalski, and he had no desire to explain to the police why his establishment had become a crime scene. He moved down the bar and addressed both men, suggesting that perhaps it was time to change the subject. But Kowalski was beyond reason now. He turned his attention to Marcus, perhaps seeing him as an easier target. He began questioning the bartender's background, noting that he seemed awfully comfortable around military personnel for a civilian. He suggested that maybe Marcus was another wannabe, someone who had never served but liked to bask in reflected glory by association. The accusation was so far off the mark that several regulars actually laughed out loud. Marcus had never claimed any military service, but he had also never hidden from questions about his past. He simply preferred not to discuss it in detail. Now, faced with Kowalski's challenge, he found himself in an uncomfortable position. Jake, who had been preparing to leave, stopped and looked at Marcus with new interest. The subtle tension in his posture suggested that he was reassessing the bartender, picking up on details he had missed before. Marcus could feel the weight of his scrutiny and knew that his careful anonymity was about to be compromised. Other patrons began to rally to Marcus's defense, describing his character and his treatment of veterans who frequented the bar. They spoke of his understanding, his generosity to those going through hard times, and his obvious respect for military service. But Kowalski dismissed their testimonials, suggesting that civilian supporters were fine in their place, but shouldn't pretend to understand what real soldiers had experienced. The staff sergeant then made his final mistake. Looking directly at Marcus, he demanded to know what gave him the right to counsel and comfort military personnel. He asked sarcastically if Marcus had a call sign, since he seemed to think he was part of their brotherhood. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the bar. He had worked hard to build a quiet life, to find peace away from the chaos that had defined his earlier years. But sometimes the past refused to stay buried, and sometimes a man had to choose between his privacy and his integrity. Marcus set down the glass he had been cleaning, looked Kowalski straight in the eye, and spoke two words that would change everything in that room. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly to every corner of the bar, and the words themselves seemed to charge the air with electricity. When those words left his lips, the effect was immediate and profound. Conversations didn't just stop. They died mid-syllable. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Pool cues froze in mid-stroke. And even the background music seemed to fade into insignificance. The entire bar became a tableau of shocked silence, with every face turned toward the man behind the bar who had just revealed himself to be something far more than anyone had imagined. Jake's reaction was perhaps the most telling of all. His eyes widened in recognition, and his casual posture shifted to something approaching attention. Color drained from his face as the implications of what he had just heard began to sink in. When he looked at Marcus now, it was with the kind of respect typically reserved for legends and ghosts, and in this case the distinction was unclear. The words "Battle Saint" seemed to echo in the sudden silence that had descended upon the anchor's rest. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nobody moved, nobody breathed, and nobody quite knew how to process what they had just heard. It was as if a myth had suddenly materialized before their eyes, flesh and blood where there should have been only whispered stories and half-remembered legends. Jake was the first to break the spell. He stood up slowly, his movement careful and deliberate, and took several steps back from the bar. His face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet. When he looked at Marcus, at Battle Saint, his eyes held a mixture of awe, fear, and something approaching reverence that was deeply uncomfortable for everyone present. Kowalski, meanwhile, seemed frozen in place. His mouth hung open as his alcohol-fogged brain struggled to process the enormity of his mistake. The name Battle Saint was known in certain circles, whispered in the kinds of places where classified operations were planned and executed. It was a name that carried weight, that commanded immediate respect, and that was absolutely never spoken lightly. Yet here he was, having spent the last hour insulting and challenging the man who owned that call sign. The other patrons in the bar were having their own moments of recognition. Some knew the name immediately, their faces showing the same shocked understanding that had overtaken Jake. Others were clearly confused, but picking up on the gravity of the situation from the reactions around them. A few began to quietly slip toward the exits, sensing that they had stumbled into something far above their security clearance level. Marcus, Battle Saint, remained behind the bar, methodically cleaning the same glass he had been working on when Kowalski asked his fateful question. His expression was calm, almost serene, but there was a weight to his presence now that hadn't been there before. It was as if saying his call sign aloud had stripped away some carefully maintained disguise, revealing the dangerous man who had always lurked beneath the surface of the friendly bartender. Jake cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the continued silence. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion and carried the formal tone of someone addressing a superior officer. He introduced himself properly this time. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, Navy SEAL Team 6, recently returned from deployment in the Middle East. He apologized for not recognizing Battle Saint immediately, explaining that he had only heard stories and had never expected to encounter the legend in person. Morrison's words seemed to unlock the paralysis that had gripped the room. Other patrons began to move again, though their movements were cautious and respectful. Several approached the bar, not to order drinks, but to pay their respects to a man whose reputation had preceded him into their midst. They spoke in hushed tones, acknowledging his service with the kind of deference typically reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. Battle Saint accepted their recognition with quiet grace, though it was clear that the attention made him uncomfortable. He continued his work behind the bar, mixing drinks and engaging in brief conversations, but the easy anonymity he had enjoyed for 3 years was gone forever. Every interaction now carried the weight of his revealed identity, and every person in the room was acutely aware that they were in the presence of someone truly exceptional. Kowalski, meanwhile, had finally found his voice. He began a stammering apology. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. He spoke of not knowing, of meaning no disrespect, of being honored to serve in the same military as someone of Battle Saint's caliber. His words tumbled over each other in their haste to distance himself from his earlier behavior, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the bar's comfortable temperature. Battle Saint listened to the apology with patience, then responded with a kindness that surprised everyone present. He acknowledged Kowalski's service, recognized the staff sergeant's dedication to his unit and his country, and made it clear that no permanent offense had been taken. He spoke of the brotherhood of arms that connected all service members, regardless of rank or specialty, and suggested that their shared commitment to protecting others was more important than any personal disagreements. The gesture was magnanimous, but it also demonstrated a level of control and leadership that further reinforced Battle Saint's legendary status. Here was a man who could have humiliated Kowalski, who could have used his reputation to destroy the staff sergeant's credibility, but instead chose to show mercy and understanding. It was a masterclass in grace under pressure and further cemented the respect of everyone present. As the evening progressed, Battle Saint found himself at the center of increasingly intense conversations about military service, special operations, and the realities of modern warfare. Morrison, in particular, seemed desperate to connect with someone who had walked similar paths. He spoke of missions that had tested his limits, of decisions that haunted his dreams, and of the challenge of transitioning between the intense focus of combat and the mundane realities of civilian life. Battle Saint listened with the patience of someone who understood these struggles intimately. He asked thoughtful questions, offered perspective without judgment, and demonstrated the kind of wisdom that came from having faced similar challenges and survived them. It became clear that his years behind the bar had not been spent hiding from his past, but rather processing it, integrating his experiences into a new understanding of service and purpose. Other veterans in the bar began sharing their own stories, drawn by the unique opportunity to speak with someone who truly understood the weight of special operations service. They spoke of the isolation that came with classified work, the difficulty of maintaining relationships with people who couldn't understand their experiences, and the challenge of finding meaning in civilian life after years of high-stakes missions. Battle Saint responded to each story with empathy and insight, but he was careful not to share details of his own operations. When pressed for specifics about his service, he deflected smoothly, explaining that some stories were not his to tell and that operational security remained important even in retirement. This discretion only added to his mystique and further demonstrated the professionalism that had made him legendary in the first place. As the night wore on, word began to spread beyond the confines of the Anchor's Rest. Other bars and gathering places for military personnel started receiving calls and texts about the discovery of Battle Saint. Veterans from across the region began making plans to visit the bar, hoping to meet the man whose reputation had become the stuff of legend within special operations communities. Battle Saint seemed to sense the changing dynamic and the challenges it would bring. During a quiet moment between customers, he spoke with Morrison about the difficulties of maintaining a low profile in the modern world. He explained that his years of anonymity had been precious to him, allowing him to heal from the psychological wounds of his service while still finding ways to support other veterans in their own struggles. Morrison listened intently, clearly struggling with guilt over his role in exposing Battle Saint's identity. He offered to spread word that the legendary operator preferred his privacy, but Battle Saint shook his head with a sad smile. He explained that once certain secrets were revealed, they couldn't be hidden again. The name Battle Saint was now connected to the quiet bartender at the Anchor's Rest, and that connection would inevitably draw attention from people and organizations he had hoped to avoid. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group of Marines who had heard about the evening's revelation through the military grapevine. They entered the bar with the kind of reverent excitement typically associated with meeting a celebrity, but Their enthusiasm was tempered by genuine respect for Battle Saint's service. They ordered drinks and positioned themselves where they could observe the legendary operator without being intrusive. Battle Saint served them with the same professional courtesy he showed all customers, but the dynamic had clearly shifted. Every movement was scrutinized, every word was analyzed for hidden meaning, and every gesture was interpreted through the lens of his revealed identity. The comfortable anonymity that had allowed him to simply be Marcus the bartender was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of living up to a legend. As closing time approached, the bar slowly emptied, but several patrons lingered, reluctant to end their encounter with a living piece of military history. Morrison was among those who stayed, using the time to ask questions about leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the psychological tools necessary for survival in extreme situations. Battle Saint's responses revealed a depth of thought and experience that went far beyond tactical expertise. He spoke of the importance of maintaining humanity in dehumanizing situations, of finding purpose beyond the immediate mission, and of the responsibility that came with the power to take life. His words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, and Morrison absorbed every syllable like a student learning from master. When the last customer finally left, Battle Saint began his closing routine with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. Morrison lingered by the door, clearly struggling with whether to say something more or simply leave. Finally, he approached the bar one last time, his expression serious and respectful. Morrison thanked Battle Saint for his service, not just to the country, but to the veterans who had found solace and understanding in his bar. He acknowledged that the evening had changed things irrevocably, but expressed hope that Battle Saint would continue to serve as a bridge between the special operations community and the civilian world that struggled to understand them. Battle Saint accepted the thanks with a nod, then offered some final words of advice. He spoke of the importance of finding balance between the warrior identity and the human being beneath it, of a need to serve others as a way of processing one's own experiences, and of the truth that real strength often lay in choosing peace over violence whenever possible. As Morrison finally left, Battle Saint finished his closing duties in solitude. The bar was quiet now, but the silence felt different than it had in years past. It was heavy with expectation, weighted with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and unwanted attention. The comfortable anonymity that had allowed him to heal and help others was gone, sacrificed to a moment of honesty and integrity. Standing alone in his empty bar, Battle Saint reflected on the events of the evening and their likely consequences. He had known this day might come, had prepared for the possibility that his past would eventually catch up with his present. Now that it had happened, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that he no longer had to carry the weight of hidden identity, but apprehension about what exposure might mean for the quiet life he had built. Outside, the Norfolk night was cool and clear, with stars visible despite the city's ambient light. Battle Saint locked the door of the Anchor's Rest and began his walk home, knowing that when he returned the next day, everything would be different. The man who had been Marcus the bartender was gone forever, replaced by the complex reality of being a legend who still had to live in the ordinary world. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with thick clouds rolling in from the Atlantic that promised rain before evening. Battle Saint arrived at the Anchor's Rest earlier than usual, using his keys to unlock the heavy wooden door as the first hints of daylight struggled through the approaching storm. The familiar ritual of opening the bar, turning on lights, checking inventory, preparing for the day ahead, felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that his carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered the night before. As he moved through his morning routine, Battle Saint's mind wandered back through the years that had brought him to this moment. The call sign Battle Saint had been earned during a series of operations in Afghanistan that had tested every limit of human endurance and moral complexity. It wasn't a name he had chosen for himself, but rather one that had emerged from the observations of fellow operators who had witnessed his unique approach to the impossible situations that defined their world. The origin of the call sign lay in his uncanny ability to maintain his humanity while performing the most inhumane tasks required by war. Other operators had watched him provide medical aid to wounded enemies, share his rations with children in war zones, and risk his own safety to protect civilians caught in crossfire. Yet when the mission required violence, he could switch to a mode of controlled lethality that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. His teammates had begun calling him Saint ironically at first, noting the contradiction between his compassionate nature and his lethal efficiency. But over time, they realized that the nickname captured something essential about his character. He fought like an avenging angel, bringing swift justice to those who threatened innocence while never losing sight of the fundamental humanity that connected all people. The battle part had been added after a particularly intense engagement, where he had single-handedly held off an enemy force for 6 hours while protecting a group of wounded soldiers. The memories were interrupted by a knock on the bar's front door. Through the glass, Battle Saint could see Lieutenant Morrison standing outside, looking uncertain and slightly embarrassed. Behind him stood another figure in civilian clothes, a woman with short dark hair and the kind of bearing that immediately identified her as military, despite her attempt to blend into the Norfolk morning crowd. Battle Saint unlocked the door and gestured them inside, noting the careful way they scanned the interior before entering. Morrison introduced his companion as Captain Sarah Chun, a Navy intelligence officer who specialized in special operations personnel. She was in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. Chin explained that word of the previous evening's revelation had traveled quickly through certain channels, and there were people in the Pentagon who were very interested in the fact that Battle Saint was alive and, well, and tending bar in Virginia. She emphasized that her visit was unofficial, a courtesy call to inform him that his newfound visibility might attract unwanted attention from various government agencies and foreign intelligence services. Battle Saint listened quietly while brewing coffee, his expression giving nothing away. When Chin finished speaking, he asked a simple question about whether he was in any immediate danger. Her hesitation before answering told him everything he needed to know. The world of special operations was small and insular, and the sudden appearance of someone with his reputation would inevitably create ripples that extended far beyond the military community. Chin explained that Battle Saint's official records showed him as killed in action during a classified operation 3 years earlier. His survival and subsequent civilian life represented a significant intelligence concern, particularly given his knowledge of ongoing and planned operations. While no one questioned his loyalty or integrity, his exposure created potential security vulnerabilities that would need to be addressed. Morrison shifted uncomfortably during this exchange, clearly feeling responsible for the complications his recognition had created. He began to apologize again, but Battle Saint cut him off with a raised hand. He explained that the truth would have emerged eventually, and that Morrison had simply been the catalyst for something that was probably inevitable. The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door. This time, the visitor was an older man in an expensive suit who moved with the kind of confidence that suggested high-level government employment. He introduced himself as Deputy Director Williams from the Department of Defense and explained that he needed to speak with Battle Saint about some urgent matters related to national security. Williams was accompanied by 2 younger men who positioned themselves strategically around the bar while maintaining the pretense of casual observation. Battle Saint recognized the formation and understood that this was not really a request for conversation, but rather a politely phrased demand for cooperation. The deputy director explained that Battle Saint's presumed death had been a necessary fiction to protect both him and ongoing operations. His survival complicated several active missions and created potential exposure for other operators who were still in the field. Williams suggested that the best solution would be for Battle Saint to return to active duty, where his exceptional skills could be utilized and his knowledge properly contained. Battle Saint poured himself a cup of coffee and considered the offer carefully. He had left the world of special operations for good reasons, driven by a combination of physical exhaustion, psychological trauma, and a growing sense that his continued service was causing more harm than good. The 3 years he had spent behind the bar had allowed him to heal in ways that had seemed impossible while he was still actively engaged in combat operations. He explained to Williams that his bartending wasn't just a job, but a form of therapy, both for himself and for the veterans who frequented his establishment. The Anchor's Rest had become a sanctuary where military personnel could process their experiences with someone who truly understood their struggles. Returning to active duty would not only end his personal healing journey, but also eliminate a resource that had helped hundreds of other veterans. Williams listened politely, but made it clear that Battle Saint's personal preferences were secondary to national security concerns. He mentioned specific operations that could be compromised by Battle Saint's exposure, foreign intelligence services that would be very interested in recruiting or eliminating him, and domestic security concerns related to his knowledge of classified programs. The conversation grew increasingly tense as Williams applied pressure while Battle Saint remained calm, but firm in his refusal to cooperate. Chun and Morrison watched the exchange with growing discomfort, recognizing that they were witnessing a confrontation between two very dangerous men who were accustomed to getting their way. The standoff was broken by the arrival of yet another visitor, an elderly man in a Marine dress blue uniform who moved with the careful dignity of advanced age but unmistakable authority. Williams immediately stood and saluted, his demeanor shifting from aggressive confidence to respectful deference. The newcomer was General Harrison, a living legend in the special operations community whose reputation commanded respect across all branches of the military. General Harrison dismissed Williams and his escorts with a few quiet words, then settled onto a bar stool and asked Battle Saint for a cup of coffee. The two men had clearly known each other in the past, and their reunion carried the weight of shared experiences and mutual respect. Harrison explained that he had heard about the previous evening's events through his own intelligence networks and had come to offer his perspective on the situation. The general acknowledged Williams's concerns about operational security, but argued that Battle Saint's current role was actually more valuable than his potential return to active duty. He described the mental health crisis among special operations personnel, the rising suicide rates, and the desperate need for effective intervention programs. Battle Saint's work at the Anchor's Rest represented exactly the kind of peer support that military psychologists had been trying to develop for years. Harrison proposed a compromise that would satisfy both security concerns and Battle Saint's desire to continue his civilian work. He suggested that Battle Saint be granted official cover as a consultant for military mental health programs, which would provide both protection and legitimacy for his activities. This arrangement would also allow him to continue operating the bar while giving him access to resources that could expand his ability to help other veterans. The proposal made sense on multiple levels, and Battle Saint found himself cautiously optimistic about the possibility of continuing his work without the constant threat of government interference. Harrison explained that the arrangement would require some concessions, including periodic debriefings and agreement to assist with certain low-risk operations that specifically required his unique skills. While they discussed the details of Harrison's proposal, the bar began to fill with its usual daytime crowd. Word of Battle Saint's identity had spread through military social media networks overnight, and veterans from across the region were making pilgrimages to the Anchor's Rest. Some came simply to see the legendary operator in person, while others hoped to share their own stories with someone who might understand their experiences. Battle Saint found himself serving drinks while simultaneously conducting what amounted to informal therapy sessions. Veterans opened up about their struggles with civilian life, their difficulty maintaining relationships, and their ongoing battles with trauma and guilt. His responses drew on both his personal experiences and the wisdom he had gained during his years of helping others process their service-related challenges. Chen observed these interactions with growing amazement, recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented in her experience. Here was a man whose tactical skills were legendary, whose combat record was the stuff of special operations folklore, choosing to serve his country by providing emotional support to struggling veterans. The decision to trade violence for healing represented a form of courage that was perhaps more impressive than his battlefield heroics. Morrison, meanwhile, was processing his own complex emotions about the situation he had inadvertently created. He had come to the bar the previous evening simply seeking a quiet drink, but his curiosity about Battle Saint's identity had set in motion events that would reshape multiple lives. The guilt he felt was tempered by his growing understanding of the positive impact that Battle Saint's revealed identity might have on the broader veteran community. As the day progressed, the Anchor's Rest became something resembling a pilgrimage site for military personnel. Veterans from all branches and eras made their way to the bar, drawn by the opportunity to meet someone whose reputation transcended the typical boundaries of military service. Battle Saint greeted each visitor with patience and respect, listening to their stories and offering insights gleaned from his own journey from warrior to healer. The atmosphere in the bar was unlike anything Chun had experienced in her years of military service. Despite the crowd, conversations remained respectful and subdued. Veterans who might normally have engaged in the typical bar behaviors of drinking and boasting instead found themselves engaged in serious discussions about service, sacrifice, and the challenge of finding purpose after military life. Battle Saint moved through these conversations like a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony, knowing when to engage directly and when to simply provide space for others to process their experiences. His presence seemed to give others permission to be vulnerable, to acknowledge their struggles without shame, and to seek the help they needed to heal from their own service-related trauma. By evening, it had become clear that the Anchor's Rest had been permanently transformed from a simple military bar into something approaching a therapeutic community. Battle Saint's revealed identity had created a focal point for veterans seeking understanding and support, and his unique combination of combat credibility and compassionate wisdom made him an ideal facilitator for these healing conversations. General Harrison stayed throughout the day, observing the interactions and taking notes for his report to Pentagon leadership. He had initially come to assess the security implications of Battle Saint's exposure, but he left convinced that the revelation might represent an opportunity rather than a problem. The informal mental health support network that was spontaneously developing around Battle Saint could potentially be replicated at other locations, creating a new model for veteran care that combined peer support with professional expertise. As the bar finally began to empty late in the evening, Battle Saint reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in less than 24 hours. His quiet life as Marcus the bartender was officially over, but something potentially more meaningful had taken its place. He was no longer hiding from his past, but rather using it as a foundation for building a better future for himself and countless other veterans who shared similar struggles. 3 weeks had passed since the revelation at the Anchor's Rest, and the world around Battle Saint had changed in ways he could never have anticipated. What had begun as a simple evening of challenge pride had evolved into something that resembled a military mental health revolution, with his bar serving as ground zero for a movement that was spreading across the veteran community like wildfire through dry grass. The physical transformation of the Anchor's Rest was immediately apparent to anyone who had known the establishment before. The cramped interior had been expanded through the acquisition of the adjacent storefront, creating space for group discussions and private conversations. New furniture had replaced the old bar stools and tables designed to facilitate conversation rather than mere drinking. The walls, once decorated with random military memorabilia, now featured a carefully curated collection of items that told the story of American military service across multiple generations and conflicts. More importantly, the clientele had evolved from a handful of local regulars to a steady stream of veterans from across the country who made pilgrimages to Norfolk specifically to visit Battle Saint's establishment. On any given day, The bar might host a Vietnam veteran seeking to process trauma from conflicts fought 50 years earlier, a recent Iraq War veteran struggling with a transition to civilian life, and active duty special operations personnel looking for wisdom from someone who had walked their path and found a way forward. Battle Saint had adapted to his new role with the same methodical precision he had once applied to military operations. His days now began before dawn with correspondence for veterans who couldn't visit in person but sought his guidance through letters and emails. He had developed a network of contacts throughout the military mental health system, allowing him to connect visitors with appropriate professional resources when their needs exceeded what peer support could provide. The arrangement with General Harrison had been formalized through a series of meetings that had taken Battle Saint to Washington, D.C. and several other military installations. His official title was now Senior Consultant for Veteran Transition Programs, a position that carried significant authority within the Department of Defense mental health bureaucracy. The role allowed him to maintain his civilian status while providing him with the resources and protection necessary to expand his impact. However, not everyone was pleased with Battle Saint's transformation from anonymous bartender to public figure. The attention he received had attracted criticism from various quarters, including some within the special operations community who believed that his openness about mental health struggles undermined the warrior ethos that defined their culture. They argued that acknowledging psychological trauma was tantamount to admitting weakness, and that Battle Saint's approach encouraged soldiers to see themselves as victims rather than warriors. This criticism came to a head on a rainy Thursday evening when a group of active duty operators entered the Anchor's Rest with the obvious intention of confronting Battle Saint directly. Their leader was Master Chief Petty Officer Rick Coleman, a SEAL with 23 years of service who represented the old-school approach to military mental health. Tough it out, drink it off, and never show weakness to the enemy or your teammates. Coleman was built like a heavyweight boxer, with scarred hands and a face that had seen too much combat to retain any softness. He approached the bar with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating others, his entourage of younger operators spreading out behind him in a formation that was clearly meant to be threatening. The regular patrons of the Anchor's Rest recognized the tension immediately and began to quietly position themselves around the room. Many of these veterans had found healing through Battle Saint's guidance, and they were prepared to defend him against any challenge to his methods or his mission. The atmosphere in the room shifted from peaceful conversation to barely contained violence as two very different philosophies of military service prepared to collide. Coleman ordered a whiskey and launched into his prepared speech without preamble. He acknowledged Battle Saint's combat record and expressed respect for his achievements in the field. However, he argued that the current direction of Battle Saint's work was dangerous to military readiness and morale. He suggested that encouraging soldiers to discuss their psychological struggles was creating a generation of weak-minded warriors who would be unable to function effectively in combat situations. Battle Saint listened to the critique with the same patient attention he gave to all visitors, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never interrupting or becoming defensive. His calm demeanor seemed to frustrate Coleman, who had clearly expected a more combative response to his challenge. The Master Chief escalated his rhetoric, suggesting that Battle Saint had gone soft during his civilian years and had forgotten what it meant to be a warrior. The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and the entire bar waited to see how Battle Saint would respond. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that had made him legendary among special operations personnel. He acknowledged Coleman's concerns and expressed understanding for the traditional approach to military mental health. He explained that his work was not intended to replace the warrior ethos, but rather to help warriors find healthy ways to process the psychological costs of their service. Battle Saint described the epidemic of suicide among military personnel, the rising rates of divorce and substance abuse, and the growing number of veterans who were unable to successfully transition to civilian life. He argued that these problems were not signs of weakness, but rather evidence that the traditional approach to military mental health was inadequate for the realities of modern warfare. Coleman dismissed these statistics, arguing that soldiers who couldn't handle the stress of military service probably didn't belong in uniform in the first place. He suggested that Battle Saint's approach was creating a culture of excuse-making that would ultimately weaken American military capabilities. The Master Chief's words were supported by nods from his followers, but they were clearly out of step with the majority of veterans present in the bar. The confrontation escalated when Coleman made the mistake of suggesting that Battle Saint's current work was a betrayal of the soldiers who had died in combat. He argued that honoring their sacrifice required maintaining the warrior traditions they had died defending, including the expectation that soldiers would tough out psychological challenges without complaint or assistance. This accusation finally provoked a response that revealed the steel beneath Battle Saint's calm exterior. His voice remained quiet, but it carried an edge that made everyone present understand that they were witnessing something dangerous. He spoke of the soldiers he had lost during his years of service, describing their courage and dedication in terms that made it clear that no one had a monopoly on honoring military sacrifice. Battle Saint then shifted to a more personal approach, asking Coleman about his own struggles with the psychological costs of military service. The question was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through the Master Chief's aggressive facade to expose the vulnerability underneath. Coleman's reaction, a momentary flicker of uncertainty and pain, confirmed what many in the room had already suspected. Even the strongest warriors carried invisible wounds that the traditional military culture was ill-equipped to address. The exchange that followed was a masterclass in psychological intervention. Battle Saint gradually drew out Coleman's own experiences with trauma, loss, and the difficulty of maintaining relationships while serving in high-stress military positions. The Master Chief's aggressive posture slowly crumbled as he found himself engaged in exactly the kind of vulnerable conversation he had come to condemn. Other patrons watched in fascination as Battle Saint demonstrated the techniques that had made him so effective at helping veterans process their experiences. He listened without judgment, asked insightful questions that helped Coleman examine his own assumptions, and provided perspective that came from his own journey through similar struggles. The confrontation that had begun as a challenge to Battle Saint's methods became an impromptu therapy session that illustrated exactly why his approach was so desperately needed. Coleman's followers found themselves drawn into the conversation as well, sharing their own experiences with the psychological challenges of military service. Several admitted to struggles with anger, relationship problems, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life during leaves and deployments. The admission of vulnerability was clearly difficult for these men, but the supportive atmosphere that Battle Saint had created made it possible for them to acknowledge needs they had previously hidden. As the evening progressed, the tone of the conversation shifted from confrontation to collaboration. Coleman found himself asking for practical advice about helping younger soldiers in his unit who were showing signs of psychological distress. Battle Saint provided specific recommendations about resources, techniques for recognizing warning signs, and ways to encourage help-seeking behavior without undermining military discipline or unit cohesion. The transformation was remarkable, but not unprecedented. Battle Saint had witnessed similar conversations dozens of times over the past few weeks. His unique combination of combat credibility and psychological insight allowed him to reach veterans who would never consider seeking traditional mental health services. The fact that he had walked their path and found a way to healing gave his words a weight that no civilian therapist could match. By the time Coleman and his team prepared to leave, the dynamic had completely reversed. Instead of challenging Battle Saint's work, they were asking how they could implement similar programs within their own units. Coleman requested contact information from military mental health professionals who understood special operations culture, and several of his subordinates asked for private conversations about their own psychological struggles. The evening's events were observed by Captain Chun, who had become a regular presence at the Anchor's Rest as part of her official duties monitoring Battle Saint's activities. She documented the interaction in her reports, noting that Battle Saint had successfully converted potential opposition into support through a combination of patience, wisdom, and tactical psychological intervention. Chen had initially been skeptical of the arrangement that allowed Battle Saint to continue his civilian work while maintaining official consultancy status. However, her weeks of observation had convinced her that his approach represented a breakthrough in military mental health treatment. The informal network of peer support that was developing around the Anchor's Rest was achieving results that traditional military mental health programs had been unable to match. The success was not without its costs. Battle Saint's increased visibility had attracted unwanted attention from various quarters, including foreign intelligence services who saw him as a potential source of information about American special operations capabilities. Chen's security briefings described at least 3 separate attempts to establish contact with Battle Saint by individuals with suspected ties to hostile foreign governments. More personally challenging was the constant stream of veterans seeking his help. Battle Saint found himself working 16-hour days, counseling visitors while simultaneously managing the expanded operations of his bar. The physical and emotional demands of the work were beginning to take their toll, and Chen had observed signs of the same kind of burnout that had driven him to leave active duty in the first place. The situation was further complicated by growing media attention. Several journalists had learned about Battle Saint's story and were pressing for interviews that would bring even greater exposure to his work. While the publicity could potentially help other veterans learn about available resources, it would also make it much more difficult for him to maintain the kind of intimate, trust-based relationships that made his counseling effective. As Battle Saint reflected on these challenges while closing the bar that evening, he found himself facing decisions that would determine not only his own future, but potentially the future of veteran mental health treatment throughout the military. The quiet life he had built as Marcus the bartender was now completely behind him, but the path forward remained uncertain and fraught with both opportunity and danger. Standing in his transformed establishment, surrounded by evidence of the lives he had touched and changed, Battle Saint realized that his journey from warrior to healer was entering a new phase. The question was whether he could navigate the complexities of his expanding role while maintaining the authenticity and effectiveness that had made his work so powerful in the first place. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening when Lieutenant Morrison's innocent question had shattered Battle Saint's carefully constructed anonymity. The Anchor's Rest had evolved far beyond its humble origins as a neighborhood military bar, becoming the epicenter of what military mental health professionals were now calling the Norfolk model of veteran peer support. The transformation was so complete that Battle Saint sometimes felt like he was living in someone else's life, surrounded by the trappings of success, but struggling to maintain the authentic connections that had made his work meaningful in the first place. The physical expansion of the Anchor's Rest had continued, with the acquisition of an entire city block that now housed not just the original bar, but also dedicated spaces for group therapy sessions, private counseling rooms, and administrative offices for the growing network of similar establishments being established across the country. The Department of Defense had provided substantial funding for the project, recognizing that Battle Saint's approach was producing measurable improvements in veteran mental health outcomes at a fraction of the cost of traditional treatment programs. What had once been an informal network of veterans helping veterans had been systematized into a comprehensive program with standardized training protocols, assessment procedures, and outcome measurements. Battle Saint found himself traveling constantly, visiting military installations and veteran organizations to train other operators and veterans in the techniques he had developed organically during his years behind the bar. The work was important and necessary, but it pulled him away from the direct service that had originally motivated his transition from warrior to healer. The irony was not lost on him that success in helping individual veterans had led to a role that often prevented him from actually helping individual veterans. His days were now filled with meetings with Pentagon officials, strategy sessions with mental health professionals, and media interviews that were designed to promote the broader program. The intimate conversations that had defined his early work at the Anchor's Rest had been largely replaced by public speaking engagements and administrative responsibilities. On this particular evening in late spring, Battle Saint stood behind the bar of the original Anchor's Rest, serving drinks to a crowd that included many faces he no longer recognized. The establishment's growing reputation had attracted tourists and military enthusiasts who came not seeking healing, but simply wanted to meet the legendary operator turned therapist. While their interest was flattering, their presence sometimes made it difficult for veterans with genuine needs to access the kind of safe space that had originally defined the bar's mission. He was reflecting on these changes when he noticed a young woman sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a single beer and watching the crowd with the kind of careful attention that immediately identified her as military personnel. Something about her posture suggested distress, and Battle Saint's trained instincts recognized the signs of someone struggling with psychological trauma. He made his way over to her table during a lull in the evening's activity. The woman introduced herself as Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, recently returned from her third deployment to Afghanistan. She had driven down from Fort Bragg specifically to visit the Anchor's Rest, having heard about Battle Saint's work through the informal networks that connected military personnel across the country. Her story was familiar, yet unique. 3 tours of combat duty as a medic had left her struggling with survivor's guilt, relationship problems, and a growing sense that she no longer fit into either military or civilian society. As Battle Saint listened to Santos describe her experiences, he was reminded of why he had originally found the work so compelling. Here was someone whose service had cost her dearly, but whose dedication to helping others remained undiminished despite her own struggles. Her questions were thoughtful and her insights were sharp, but beneath the professional competence was a deep well of pain that she had been carrying alone for months. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a news crew that had been granted permission to film a documentary about the Norfolk model. The producer, an enthusiastic woman in her 30s who clearly saw Battle Saint's story as her ticket to a prestigious journalism award, immediately began directing her cameraman to capture what she called authentic interactions between the legendary Battle Saint and real veterans. Battle Saint politely, but firmly declined to allow Santos to be filmed, recognizing that the media attention would compromise the kind of vulnerable conversation they had been having. However, the presence of the cameras had already changed the dynamic in the bar, with some patrons performing for the cameras while others retreated into uncomfortable silence. The authentic atmosphere that had made the Anchor's Rest special was being replaced by something artificial and self-conscious. After the news crew left, Battle Saint found Santos preparing to leave as well. She explained that the media circus had made her uncomfortable and that she was no longer sure the Anchor's Rest could provide the kind of genuine support she had been seeking. Her disappointment was evident, and Battle Saint realized that he was witnessing the unintended consequences of his program's success. This realization prompted Battle Saint to make a decision that would surprise everyone who had come to see him as fully committed to his role as the public face of military mental health innovation. He asked Santos to wait while he made a phone call, then returned with an invitation that would change both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. Battle Saint explained that he had been considering a return to more direct service, away from the administrative and media responsibilities that had come to dominate his time. He had been quietly exploring the possibility of establishing a retreat facility in rural Virginia, where veterans could find the kind of authentic peer support that was becoming increasingly difficult to provide in the public spotlight of the Anchor's Rest. The facility would be small and deliberately low profile, designed to accommodate no more than a dozen veterans at a time, for intensive workshops focused on processing combat trauma and developing healthy transition strategies. Battle Saint would personally facilitate these sessions, drawing on both his combat experience and the counseling techniques he had refined during his years of informal therapy work. Santos listened with growing interest as Battle Saint described his vision for the retreat. The facility would be staffed entirely by veterans who had successfully processed their own trauma and were trained in peer support techniques. The environment would be deliberately rustic and non-clinical, designed to feel more like a camping trip with understanding friends than a traditional therapy program. Most importantly, the retreat would operate completely outside the media spotlight that had begun to compromise the authenticity of the Anchor's Rest experience. Participants would be carefully screened not only for their therapeutic needs, but also for their commitment to maintaining the privacy and integrity of the program. No cameras, no interviews, no public recognition, just veterans helping veterans in an environment designed specifically for healing. Battle Saint offered Santos a position as the retreat's first associate facilitator, recognizing that her combination of combat experience, medical training, and personal struggle with trauma made her an ideal candidate for the role. The position would require her to complete an intensive training program in peer counseling techniques, but her military background had already provided her with many of the foundational skills necessary for the work. Santos accepted the offer without hesitation, recognizing it as an opportunity to find her own path to healing while simultaneously helping other veterans who shared similar struggles. The decision represented a major life change, requiring her to leave the Army and commit to a new career in veteran services, but it also offered the possibility of finding purpose and meaning in her post-military life. Over the following months, Battle Saint gradually transferred many of his responsibilities at the Anchor's Rest to the trained staff who had been working under his supervision. While he maintained his official role as senior consultant for veteran transition programs, he negotiated an arrangement that allowed him to focus primarily on the retreat facility while others managed the day-to-day operations of the expanding Norfolk Model Program. The retreat, which they named Sanctuary Ridge, opened in a renovated camp facility nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 2 hours west of Norfolk. The location was deliberately isolated, accessible only by a winding mountain road that discouraged casual visitors and provided participants with a sense of separation from the outside world that enhanced their ability to focus on their healing process. The first group of participants included veterans from all branches of service and all eras of American military involvement. Some were recent returnees from Iraq and Afghanistan, while others were Vietnam veterans who had been carrying psychological wounds for decades. What united them was their willingness to engage in the kind of honest self-examination that traditional military culture often discouraged. Battle Saint's approach to group facilitation drew heavily on his understanding of military culture and the specific challenges faced by combat veterans. Sessions began each day with physical training that helped participants reconnect with their bodies and process trauma through movement. The schedule included individual counseling sessions, group discussions, outdoor activities designed to build trust and communication skills, and evening reflection periods where participants could process their experiences in a supportive environment. Santos proved to be a natural facilitator, bringing a combination of empathy and directness that resonated strongly with participants. Her own ongoing recovery process made her particularly effective at helping others recognize that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. Her medical background also allowed her to address the physical manifestations of trauma that often accompanied the psychological symptoms. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Participants consistently reported significant improvements in their ability to manage trauma symptoms, communicate with family members, and envision positive futures for themselves. More importantly, many became advocates for seeking help within their own military and veteran communities, creating ripple effects that extended the program's impact far beyond the small number of people who could be directly served. Word of Sanctuary Ridge's success began to spread through the same informal networks that had originally brought veterans to the Anchor's Rest. Requests for admission far exceeded the facility's capacity, but Battle Saint was determined to maintain the intimate scale that made the program effective. Instead of expanding, he began training other veteran facilitators to establish similar retreats in other parts of the country. The media attention that had complicated his work at the Anchor's Rest remained largely absent from Sanctuary Ridge, partly due to its remote location, but primarily because of Battle Saint's insistence on protecting the privacy of participants. He had learned that authentic healing required an environment where veterans felt safe to be vulnerable, and that such vulnerability was impossible in the presence of cameras and reporters. As Battle Saint reflected on his journey from anonymous bartender to public figure to retreat facilitator, he realized that each phase had taught him something important about the nature of service and healing. His combat experience had given him credibility with other veterans. His years behind the bar had taught him the importance of listening and creating safe spaces, and his brief time in the public spotlight had shown him the limitations of large-scale programs. The work at Sanctuary Ridge represented a synthesis of all these experiences, combining the intimate scale of his early bar work with the systematic approach he had developed during his time as a public consultant. Most importantly, it allowed him to maintain the authentic connections with individual veterans that had originally motivated his transition from warrior to healer. Standing on the deck of the retreat facility as the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, Battle Saint watched a group of participants engaged in an evening discussion around a campfire. Their conversation was animated but respectful as veterans from different eras and conflicts shared their experiences and insights with each other. Santos moved among them, offering gentle guidance when needed, but mostly allowing the natural healing power of peer support to work its quiet magic. This was what he had been searching for since the night Lieutenant Morrison had asked about his call sign, a way to serve that honored both his past as a warrior and his present commitment to healing. The legend of Battle Saint would always be part of his identity, but it no longer defined the limits of what he could become. In choosing to help others find their own paths to healing, he had discovered that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons, but with compassion, understanding, and the courage to be vulnerable in service of others. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. Every veteran who found healing at Sanctuary Ridge would return to their communities with new tools for managing trauma and new perspectives on what it meant to serve. They would become ambassadors for a different way of thinking about military mental health, proving that seeking help was not a sign of weakness, but rather a demonstration of the same courage that had made them effective warriors. As night fell over the mountains, Battle Saint knew that he had finally found his true calling. The call sign that had once defined his prowess in combat now represented something entirely different. A commitment to helping other warriors find their way home from the psychological battlefields that continued long after the shooting stopped. In serving others, he had learned to serve himself, and in helping others heal, he had discovered that his own wounds could become sources of strength rather than shame.